The November air in Wyoming's backcountry had a bite to it that cut through even the heaviest wool. Ranger Lucas Grant zipped his jacket tighter as he stood outside the Thoroughfare Ranger Station, scanning the vast expanse of wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. This was one of the most isolated outposts in the continental United States, nearly 30 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by horseback or foot. He'd volunteered for this rotation, drawn by the solitude and the challenge of monitoring this remote corner of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem where wolves hunted and grizzlies prepared for their winter sleep. Before you dive deeper into this mystery, we'd love to have you subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We read every single one. Lucas had been a ranger for 11 years, following in the footsteps of his father, who'd spent 3 decades with the Park Service before retiring to a small cabin in Montana. His mother had passed when Lucas was 16, leaving just the two of them to navigate grief in their own quiet ways. His father had taught him to read weather patterns in cloud formations, to track elk through dense timber, to respect the wilderness without fearing it. Lucas carried those lessons with him every day, along with the leather-bound field journal his father had given him when he earned his ranger badge. The patrol schedule was methodical and predictable. Every 3 days, Lucas would ride out on horseback to check the southern quadrant of his territory, documenting wildlife activity, inspecting trail conditions, and ensuring no unauthorized camping had occurred. He'd return before dark, log his findings in the station's official record book, and radio his status to the district office 40 miles north. The routine had a meditative quality to it. Just him, the horse named Jasper, and hundreds of thousands of acres of untouched wilderness. On November 8th, Lucas completed his standard patrol. His log entry, recorded at 4:47 p.m. in his precise handwriting, noted fresh grizzly tracks near Bridger Creek, a small group of elk moving toward lower elevations, and deteriorating weather conditions suggesting an early winter storm system. He signed off on the radio at 5:15 p.m., his voice calm and professional as always. Thoroughfare Station, all clear. Next check-in scheduled for November 11th. Grant out. That was the last time anyone heard Lucas Grant's voice. When Lucas failed to make his November 11th radio check-in, the district supervisor, Catherine Brennan, wasn't immediately alarmed. Radio equipment could fail, storms could interfere with transmissions, and experienced rangers sometimes extended patrols if they encountered situations requiring attention. She noted the missed check-in, but decided to wait until the following day before taking action. Catherine had worked with Lucas for 6 years and trusted his judgment implicitly. He'd never given her reason to worry. By November 12th, with still no contact, Catherine's concern grew. She dispatched 2 rangers, Vincent Reyes and Ada Chen, to make the long trek into Thoroughfare Station. They left at dawn, pushing hard through increasingly difficult terrain as the temperature dropped and snow began to fall. They arrived at the remote cabin just after sunset on November 13th, exhausted but driven by growing unease. The station appeared undisturbed from the outside. Jasper stood in the small corral, adequately fed and watered, which suggested Lucas had been there recently enough to care for the horse. But when Vincent and Ada entered the cabin, they found it empty. Lucas's gear remained neatly organized. His sleeping bag rolled on the bunk, cooking supplies clean and stored, extra batteries for his radio charging on the windowsill. Everything suggested he'd simply stepped out for a routine task. Then Ada noticed the logbook lying open on the rough wooden desk. The last entry was dated November 12th at 9:23 a.m., 4 days after Lucas's final radio transmission, and 1 day after he'd missed his scheduled check-in. The handwriting matched Lucas's distinctive style, the same careful letters he'd been using for years. The entry was brief but deeply unsettling. Movement observed northeast quadrant. 3 individuals, no permits visible, departing to investigate. Weather deteriorating. We'll update upon return. Vincent immediately got on the radio to Catherine. He wrote this yesterday morning, he said, his voice tight with confusion. But that's impossible. He missed check-in on the 11th. If he was here on the 12th, why didn't he radio in? Catherine authorized an immediate search. By November 14th, a team of 12 rangers and search and rescue specialists had assembled at Thoroughfare Station, despite worsening weather conditions. They fanned out across the northeast quadrant, following the direction indicated in Lucas's log entry. The snow had covered most tracks, but they searched methodically, calling his name until their voices went hoarse. Lucas's father, Robert Grant, arrived at the district office on November 15th. At 71, he looked older than his years, the lines in his face deepened by worry. "My son doesn't make mistakes in the field," he told Catherine, his hands shaking slightly as he held a cup of coffee. If he wrote that, he saw people without permits, then he saw them. And if he went to investigate, he would have come back. The search expanded. Rangers examined every inch of terrain within a 10-mile radius of the station. They found no sign of struggle, no abandoned equipment, no indication of where Lucas had gone or what had happened to him. The investigation into the 3 individuals he'd mentioned in his log entry hit immediate dead ends. No permits had been issued for that area during November, and no hikers or hunters had reported being in the region. But the log entry itself became the focus of intense scrutiny. Handwriting analysts from the FBI compared it to years of Lucas's previous entries. The conclusion was unequivocal. The handwriting was Lucas Grant's, with no signs of forgery or duress. The pressure of the pen strokes, the spacing, the characteristic way he formed certain letters, every detail matched his established pattern. The timestamp, however, was impossible. According to every established protocol, every routine Lucas had followed for years, if he had been at the station on the morning of November 12th, he would have made radio contact. The radio equipment at Thoroughfare Station was tested and found to be in perfect working order. The weather on November 12th, while cold, had not been severe enough to prevent transmission. There was no logical reason for Lucas to skip a mandatory check-in, write a log entry, and then depart on an investigation without notifying anyone. Catherine assembled a timeline on a large whiteboard in the district office, color-coding every confirmed piece of information. November 8th. Lucas completes routine patrol, makes radio contact at 5:15 p.m. November 9th and 10th. No scheduled check-ins, normal days off. November 11th, scheduled check-in missed, first red flag. November 12th, log entry written at 9:23 a.m., but no radio contact made. November 13th, rangers discover empty station and the impossible log entry. "What happened between the 8th and the 12th?" she asked the assembled team, tapping the marker against the board. "Where was he? Why didn't he call in on the 11th? And why, if he was alive and well enough to write in the logbook on the 12th, didn't he use the radio?" Robert Grant sat in the corner of the office, listening to the theories and speculation. His son had taught him to trust evidence over emotion, to follow facts wherever they led. But the facts in this case led nowhere. They circled back on themselves, creating paradoxes that couldn't be explained. Vincent Reyes had an idea. What if someone else was at the station on the 12th? What if they forged the entry to buy time? But the handwriting analysis had eliminated that possibility. Ada Chen suggested equipment malfunction. Maybe Lucas had tried to radio in, but the transmission failed. But the equipment had been tested thoroughly and worked perfectly. The search continued for 3 weeks, eventually covering over 200 square miles of wilderness. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the rugged terrain. Tracking dogs were brought in, given Lucas's scent from clothing at the station, but they found nothing. The investigation expanded to include interviews with every person who'd been anywhere near the greater Yellowstone area in early November. Not a single lead materialized. As winter deepened and snow made further searching impossible, the case shifted from rescue to recovery, and eventually to something harder to define. Lucas Grant had vanished, but he'd left behind a message that shouldn't exist, dated days after he'd apparently disappeared. The impossible timestamp haunted everyone involved, a riddle that refused to yield its secrets. In the small Montana town where Robert Grant lived, people spoke quietly about the missing ranger. Some offered the usual explanations: animal attack, falling through ice, getting lost in a whiteout. But those theories didn't account for the log entry, the calm words written in Lucas's own hand, days after he'd gone silent. Catherine Brennan kept the case file on her desk, refusing to close it or file it away with other cold cases. She'd review the evidence periodically, hoping some new detail would emerge, some overlooked clue that would crack the mystery open. The logbook from Thoroughfare Station sat in an evidence locker, the November 12th entry preserved behind plastic, the handwriting as clear and inexplicable as the day it was discovered. The official search was suspended in late December when snow depths made the backcountry inaccessible. Robert Grant, however, never stopped looking. Throughout the winter, despite his age and the harsh conditions, he made periodic trips to the edges of the wilderness, carrying photographs of his son, asking anyone he encountered if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. The other rangers worried about him, this old man driven by grief and determination, but they understood. Some of them had lost colleagues in the wilderness before, but never like this. Never with a mystery so profound it seemed to defy the laws of time itself. When spring finally came to the Wyoming backcountry, the snowmelt revealed no new evidence, no remains, no equipment, no clues. Catherine organized a fresh search effort, bringing in volunteers from multiple agencies, but the results were the same. Lucas Grant had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. It was a young ranger named Olivia Park who first noticed the pattern in the old records. She'd been assigned to digitize decades of patrol logs from various backcountry stations, a tedious task that most rangers avoided. But Olivia was methodical and curious, and as she worked through box after box of handwritten entries, she began to notice anomalies. In 1982, a ranger named David Kowalski had disappeared from a remote station in Montana. In 1995, a ranger named Jennifer Morrison had vanished from a backcountry post in Colorado. In both cases, log entries had been found dated after the ranger's last confirmed contact. The handwriting in each case had been verified as authentic, but the timestamps were impossible. Olivia brought her findings to Catherine in early June. The two women spread the copied log pages across the conference table, comparing dates and details. The pattern was undeniable, though spread across decades and multiple locations. 3 rangers, all working in remote backcountry stations, all disappearing under circumstances that defied logic, all leaving behind log entries that shouldn't exist. Why hasn't anyone connected these before? Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Catherine stared at the documents, her mind racing. Different agencies, different decades, different states, no central database. No reason for anyone to look for a pattern. They began pulling every file they could access, searching for similar cases. The work was painstaking and often frustrating, as many older records had been poorly maintained or lost entirely. But over the following weeks, they identified 2 more cases that fit the pattern. 1967 in Idaho, 2003 in Washington. 5 rangers over nearly 60 years, all vanished from remote stations, all leaving behind log entries time-stamped after their disappearances. Catherine contacted families of the missing rangers, gently reopening old wounds in the service of understanding. David Kowalski's sister, now in her 70s, remembered the confusion and grief of her brother's disappearance. They told us he must have gotten lost, had an accident, she said over the phone, her voice trembling with decades-old pain. But David knew those mountains better than anyone. And the log entry. They never explained the log entry. Jennifer Morrison's husband had remarried years ago, but still carried the weight of unanswered questions. I used to think someone had kidnapped her, forced her to write that entry, he told Catherine during a difficult phone conversation. But the handwriting experts said no, said there were no signs of stress or duress in how she wrote. It was just her writing normally on a day she couldn't possibly have been there. Robert Grant, when presented with this information, responded with a mix of vindication and deeper sorrow. So my son wasn't the first, he said quietly, and probably won't be the last. The discovery of the pattern changed the nature of the investigation. Catherine reached out to contacts in other agencies, carefully presenting the evidence without sounding like a conspiracy theorist. Most were skeptical, some were intrigued, a few were hostile to the implication that something systematic might be happening in the nation's most remote wilderness areas. But one retired investigator, a man named Gregory Hill, who'd worked for the National Park Service for 40 years, contacted Catherine after hearing about her research. "I've been tracking something similar for 20 years, he said when they met at a diner in Jackson Hole. Not just rangers, hikers, hunters, researchers, people who go into the deep backcountry and never come out, but the ones who leave messages behind, those are the cases that never made sense." Gregory had files, thick folders full of newspaper clippings, incident reports, and personal notes. He spread them across the diner table, pointing to specific cases with a gnarled finger. 1973 experienced hunter found his camp, but not him. Journal entry from the day after he was reported missing. 1988, wildlife biologist radio collar data shows her in 2 places at once. 2001, hiking couple left a note in a trail register 3 days after they disappeared. Catherine felt cold despite the warm June day. "What does it mean? What's happening out there?" Gregory leaned back, his weathered face grave. "I don't know. I've spent 2 decades trying to answer that question. No pattern in the locations beyond remoteness. No pattern in the victims beyond experience. They're always people who know the wilderness, not inexperienced tourists. And always the messages, the timestamps that don't work." As summer progressed, Catherine assembled what she privately called the Impossible Timestamp Task Force, herself, Olivia, Gregory, and 2 other investigators who'd encountered similar cases in their careers. They worked quietly, knowing that official channels would likely dismiss their findings as coincidence or error. They created a database, cross-referencing locations, dates, victim profiles, weather conditions, and every other variable they could identify. Robert Grant visited Thoroughfare Station in July, making the long trek on horseback despite Catherine's concerns about his age and health. Vincent Reyes accompanied him, understanding that the old man needed to see the place where his son had last been confirmed alive. They sat in the cabin as evening fell, the same cabin Lucas had occupied months earlier. "He loved this work," Robert said quietly, running his hand over the wooden desk where Lucas had written his final log entry. "Even as a boy, he'd rather be in the woods than anywhere else. After his mother died, the wilderness was where he found peace." Vincent didn't respond, just listened as the old man talked about his son, about family camping trips and early morning fishing expeditions, about the day Lucas graduated from ranger training and the pride that had swelled in Robert's chest. These stories were all he had left now, memories and unanswered questions. Back at the district office, the task force had made a discovery. Olivia, poring over topographic maps, noticed that many of the disappearances, not all, but a significant cluster, occurred in areas with specific geological features: deep ravines, extensive cave systems, regions with unusual mineral deposits. It wasn't a perfect correlation, but it was something. Could there be natural explanations we're missing? She proposed during one of their meetings. Underground voids that could swallow someone? Magnetic anomalies that affect equipment or perception? Gregory shook his head slowly. I've considered every natural explanation. They don't account for the messages. If Lucas fell into a ravine on November 8th, he didn't write that log entry on November 12th. If he was lost or injured, he would have used the radio. The physical evidence tells us he was at that station, alive and functional, 4 days after he went silent. That's not geology. That's something else. The task force expanded their search to international cases, wondering if the pattern extended beyond U.S. borders. They found similar incidents in Canada, Australia, and Scandinavia. Remote areas, experienced outdoors people, impossible timestamps. The pattern was global, though rare enough that no one had previously connected the dots across continents and decades. Catherine received pushback from her superiors when word of her investigation leaked. "You're chasing ghosts," her regional director told her bluntly. "Lucas Grant got lost and died in the wilderness. It happens. The log entry is either misread, misdated, or there's some explanation we haven't found yet. But it's not a mystery, it's a tragedy, and you need to let it go." She nodded politely during that meeting but had no intention of stopping. Too many families had been left without answers for too long. Too many dedicated professionals had vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind only riddles and grief. By autumn, a year after Lucas's disappearance, the task force had documented 47 cases worldwide, spanning 70 years, that fit the impossible timestamp pattern. 47 people who'd entered remote wilderness areas and never returned, but who'd somehow left messages, written, recorded, or otherwise documented, from times and dates that defied rational explanation. Robert Grant's health was declining. The stress and grief had taken their toll, and by October he was using a cane to walk, his hands trembling more noticeably. But he attended every meeting Catherine would allow, listening to the evidence, adding his own observations when relevant. "My son is part of something bigger than we understand," he told the group during one session. "I may never know what happened to him, but at least now I know he wasn't alone." The question that haunted them all was simple but unanswerable. Where did the missing people go? If they died in the wilderness, as conventional wisdom suggested, their remains should eventually be found. If they were victims of foul play, there should be evidence of violence or struggle. If they simply got lost, experienced outdoors people like Lucas Grant would know how to signal for help, how to survive until rescue arrived. The log entries themselves offered no clues beyond their impossible existence. Lucas's final words: "Movement observed northeast quadrant. 3 individuals, no permits visible, departing to investigate," could be taken at face value as the actions of a dedicated ranger doing his job. But the 3 individuals were never found, never identified, and possibly never existed in any conventional sense. Olivia proposed a theory one evening as the task force worked late. What if time works differently in some places? What if there are locations where past, present, and future overlap somehow, and these people slip through? Catherine wanted to dismiss it as science fiction, but the evidence refused to yield to conventional explanations. "If that's true," she said slowly, "then they could be anywhere, or any when." Gregory, the most experienced investigator among them, spoke carefully. "I've spent my career trusting evidence and logic. This case violates both, but I know what the handwriting analysts confirmed. Those log entries are genuine, written by the people who disappeared, at times when they couldn't have been where they were. Either our understanding of reality is incomplete, or something is happening in the deep wilderness that we can't explain with current science." In December, as winter closed in once again on the Wyoming backcountry, Catherine made the difficult decision to formally close the active search for Lucas Grant. The case would remain open, but without new evidence, no further resources would be allocated. She called Robert to inform him personally, her voice heavy with the weight of failure. "I know you did everything you could," the old man said, his voice weak but steady. "More than most would have. You found the pattern, connected my son to those others. That means something, even if we don't know what yet." "I'm not giving up," Catherine assured him. "The official search may be over, but the investigation continues. If there are answers to be found, we'll find them." Robert Grant died in his sleep on January 15th, 13 months after his son's disappearance. The local paper ran a small obituary, noting his decades of service with the Park Service and mentioning that he was predeceased by his wife and son. Catherine attended the funeral, standing in the back of the small chapel as friends and former colleagues shared memories of a man devoted to wilderness and family. After the service, an elderly woman approached Catherine. "You're the ranger who investigated Lucas," she said. "It wasn't a question. Robert talked about you, about your work trying to understand what happened." Catherine nodded, unsure what to say. The woman pressed an envelope into her hand. "Robert wanted you to have this. He wrote it a few weeks before he passed." Back in her hotel room, Catherine opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The letter was written in shaky handwriting, but the words were clear. "Catherine, by the time you read this, I'll likely be gone. I want you to know that your work meant more to me than I could express. You took my son's disappearance seriously when others wanted to file it away as another wilderness tragedy. You found the pattern, connected the dots no one else saw. That gave me peace in my final months, not the peace of answers, but the peace of knowing someone cared enough to search for truth. Keep investigating, keep looking for connections. My son and all the others deserve that. They deserve to be more than statistics, more than unsolved mysteries. They were real people who loved the wilderness and vanished into it under circumstances that defy understanding. Find out why, find out how, and if you can, find out where they went. Thank you for everything, Robert Grant." Catherine sat on the hotel bed, the letter in her lap, tears streaming down her face. She'd been a ranger for 18 years, had dealt with deaths and disappearances before, but this case had gotten under her skin in a way nothing else had. The impossible timestamp, the pattern across decades, the families left without closure, it all added up to something profoundly wrong with the conventional understanding of wilderness disappearances. The task force continued their work throughout 2026, slowly and methodically. They developed better systems for tracking cases, reached out to international agencies, and gradually built a network of investigators and researchers interested in the phenomenon. The work was slow and often discouraging, but they persisted. Olivia Park eventually requested a transfer to work full-time on the investigation, which was denied by higher-ups who considered it a waste of resources. She resigned from the Park Service and continued the research independently, supporting herself with freelance writing about wilderness safety and conservation. Her articles never mentioned the impossible timestamps or the pattern she'd discovered, but they helped pay the bills while she pursued what had become her life's work. Gregory Hill passed away in his sleep in the summer of 2027, leaving behind decades of research and files that his family donated to Olivia's growing archive. She organized a small memorial gathering for him, attended by the remaining task force members and a handful of other investigators who'd become involved over the years. "He spent 20 years on this," Olivia said during the gathering. 2 decades trying to understand something that seems designed to defy understanding, but he never stopped believing that answers existed somewhere. Catherine, now graying and nearing retirement herself, nodded. "The hard part is accepting that we may never find those answers in our lifetimes. This could be a multi-generational investigation, something that takes decades or centuries to fully comprehend. The database continued to grow. By 2028, they documented 73 cases, fitting the impossible timestamp pattern, spanning from the 1950s to the present day. The cases occurred in remote wilderness areas across 6 continents, involved people ranging from experienced rangers to researchers to hunters and hikers, and defied every conventional explanation. Technology offered new possibilities. Olivia began working with a team of data scientists to apply machine learning algorithms to the accumulated data, searching for patterns too subtle for human analysis to detect. The preliminary results suggested clusters in both time and space. Certain years and certain locations saw higher incidences of impossible timestamp cases, but the pattern remained elusive and incomplete. Meanwhile, at Thoroughfare Station and other remote outposts like it, rangers continued their patrols. They knew the stories, whispered among themselves about Lucas Grant and the others who'd vanished. Some treated it as cautionary tales about wilderness dangers. Others wondered if they might be next, if some invisible boundary waited to be crossed. The logbooks were still maintained with the same careful discipline, each entry time-stamped and signed. Rangers made their scheduled radio check-ins, aware that the same routine Lucas had followed was meant to prevent exactly what had happened to him. But routines couldn't protect against something that operated outside normal understanding of cause and effect. In the fall of 2029, nearly 4 years after Lucas Grant's disappearance, a group of hikers found something in the northeast quadrant of the Thoroughfare region. It was a small metal badge, tarnished and partially buried in soil near a ravine. The hikers turned it over to park rangers, who immediately recognized it as a Park Service badge. The serial number matched Lucas Grant's issued equipment. Catherine, now retired but still deeply involved in the investigation, made the trip to examine the location where the badge was found. The area had been searched multiple times in the months after Lucas's disappearance, but the badge could have been missed in the snow or washed into its current location during spring runoff, or it could have appeared there more recently, placed or dropped by means unknown. She stood in the wilderness, holding the badge in her gloved hand, feeling the weight of years of investigation and grief. The badge was real, physical proof that Lucas had been in this area at some point. But it answered nothing about where he'd gone or how he'd written that log entry days after he vanished. Searchers combed the area around the badge discovery for weeks, using ground-penetrating radar and trained dogs, hoping for some final resolution. They found nothing else. No remains, no equipment, no clues, just the badge lying in the soil as if it had always been there. The discovery reignited public interest in the case briefly. Local news stations ran retrospectives about the missing ranger and the mysterious log entry, but without answers or closure, the stories eventually faded from headlines, replaced by more immediate concerns. Catherine donated all her research files to Olivia's archive before passing away in 2031. She died without answers, but never having stopped searching for them. Her final report, written months before her death, concluded with words that became a sort of mission statement for those continuing the investigation. The wilderness holds secrets we may never fully understand, but we owe it to those who disappeared, Lucas Grant and all the others, to never stop asking questions, never stop searching for truth, even when that truth seems impossible. Olivia continued the work, now in her 50s, with a lifetime already devoted to the mystery. She trained younger researchers, passing on the accumulated knowledge and the methodologies developed over decades. The database grew to include over 100 cases, each one carefully documented, each one representing a person who'd walked into the wilderness and never walked out, leaving behind only questions and impossible timestamps. In remote ranger stations across the continent, New generations of rangers maintained their logbooks and made their radio check-ins. They wrote carefully time-stamped entries documenting weather conditions, wildlife observations, and patrol activities. They followed protocols designed to ensure their safety and accountability, and sometimes, in the quiet of those isolated outposts, they thought about Lucas Grant and the others. They thought about the November day when an experienced ranger wrote a log entry that shouldn't exist, documenting 3 individuals who were never found before departing on an investigation from which he never returned. The wilderness remained vast and largely indifferent to human concerns. Elk migrated, grizzlies hibernated, seasons turned. In the deep backcountry where few people ventured, where satellite phones couldn't reach, and the nearest road was days away, the same timeless rhythms continued. But somewhere in that wilderness, in the spaces between what was known and what was possible, the mystery persisted. 47 people had become 73, then 100, then more. Each one left behind families seeking closure, investigators seeking answers, and log entries that defied the fundamental nature of time itself. Lucas Grant's final log entry remained preserved in an evidence locker, the handwriting still clear after years, the timestamp still impossible. Movement observed northeast quadrant. 3 individuals, no permits visible, departing to investigate. Weather deteriorating, will update upon return. He never returned. The update never came. But the log entry existed. Physical proof of something that couldn't have happened, written in the careful hand of a ranger who'd vanished into the wilderness he loved, leaving behind only questions that might never be answered and a mystery that defied all attempts at rational explanation. In the end, the wilderness kept its secrets. The pattern continued, rare but persistent, scattered across decades and continents. Experienced outdoors people vanished from remote locations, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they left messages from times they couldn't have been alive to write them. The investigation continued, passed from one generation of researchers to the next, driven by the conviction that answers existed somewhere, even if they lay beyond current human understanding. The families of the disappeared found what comfort they could in knowing that someone still searched, still questioned, still refused to accept the easy explanations that didn't explain anything. And in ranger stations across the remote wilderness, log books were maintained with careful precision, each entry time-stamped and signed, each one a small act of faith that documentation mattered, that protocols provided safety, that writing down the truth created a record that would endure. But everyone who maintained those logs knew, in the quiet moments before sleep, that sometimes the truth was stranger than any protocol could account for, and that the wilderness held mysteries that human understanding might never fully penetrate.